Why did the golden marriage of Debbie Reynolds and Eddie Fisher, the two most beloved sweethearts of America, end in a betrayal that involved their closest friend, Elizabeth Taylor? We are not just talking about a secret affair, but a total collapse of the perfect images that Hollywood worked so hard to build. Was Elizabeth really the villain, or was she just a mirror for a truth that Eddie was too afraid to face alone? Today, we reveal the hidden psychological forces that pushed three icons into a disaster that would shatter the golden age of cinema forever. In 1958, the entire world looked at the photos of Debbie Reynolds looking heartbroken on her doorstep, and they immediately found someone to blame. The public saw a very clear picture of a predatory woman, Elizabeth Taylor, stealing the husband of a sweet and innocent mother. To every fan in America, it was a simple story of a man who was seduced by a siren and a family that was destroyed by greed and lust. The newspapers were filled with stories of Elizabeth as the ultimate homewrecker and Eddie Fisher as the weak man who had forgotten his duty to his wife and children. People were certain that they knew the hearts of these stars based on the headlines and the staged photographs. It seemed obvious that this was just another case of a man wanting something new and a woman who did not care about the pain she caused to her friend. There was no doubt in anyone's mind about who was the victim and who was the offender. However, this surface-level judgment was based on a scripted reality that hid a much darker truth. There were silent forces moving beneath the glamour that the public was not allowed to see. To find out why this betrayal was actually a cry for help, we must look deeper. The truth of this scandal lies in the heavy price of the masks these stars were forced to wear. First, we must understand that Debbie and Eddie were living as the perfect American couple, which left no room for their real human flaws. They were trapped in a role that was slowly suffocating their true identities until they felt like ghosts in their own home. Second, the arrival of Elizabeth Taylor represented the hidden shadow that Eddie had suppressed for his entire career. She was the raw and unfiltered energy that his polished life was missing, and he was drawn to her because she was the only person who lived without an artificial mask. Third, Elizabeth and Eddie were bonded by a deep and terrifying grief after the death of Mike Todd. They did not come together for pleasure, but they were trying to find a lost piece of their own souls in the wake of a tragedy. They were two broken individuals who found a way to be authentic in a world that only valued their outward appearance. The scandal was the moment their real selves finally broke through the surface of the Hollywood lie, because they could no longer breathe inside the roles they were forced to play. The proof of this internal struggle is found in the way the industry and the stars used their pain as a form of performance. Look at the famous photo of Debbie Reynolds with a safety pin and a diaper on her blouse while she spoke to the press. This was a calculated use of her public image to gain the sympathy of the nation, because she knew that being the victim was the only way she could maintain her status. She was clinging to her role as the innocent girl, even as her world was falling apart. On the other side, we see the evidence in how the studios began to market Elizabeth Taylor as a dangerous woman to sell movie tickets. They used her real-life reputation to fuel the success of the film, Butterfield 8, which proves that the business valued her dark side more than her humanity. The daughter of the couple, Carrie Fisher, later wrote about how her father was a man who seemed to have no identity of his own. She described him as a person who was always searching for himself in the eyes of powerful women, because the studios had erased his true character. Even the private letters from that time show that all three people were exhausted by the demands of being idols. They were exhausted by the need to stay frozen in a version of themselves that did not exist. The financial records of the time show that the scandal was the most profitable event in the history of their careers, which shows that the public was hungry for the destruction of the very icons they worshipped. This evidence points to a world where the stars were not people, but products that were designed to be consumed. The intense hatred that the public felt for Elizabeth was actually a reflection of their own hidden desires to break the rules. Every piece of proof, from the stage media events to the legal documents, reveals a system that was built on the fragmentation of the human soul. The real proof is the long and painful silence that followed the divorce, where each person had to struggle to find a life that was honest and real without the protection of a studio script. They were finally free, but they were forced to pay a price that lasted for the rest of their lives. The evidence shows that the betrayal was not just between friends, but a betrayal of their own true selves. The moment of total truth occurred on an afternoon when the wall between the public mask and the private soul finally collapsed. Debbie Reynolds had been living in a state of growing suspicion as she watched her husband slip away from her. She made the choice to call the hotel suite where Elizabeth Taylor was staying, because she needed to hear the truth from her closest friend. When the call was connected, it was not the voice of Elizabeth that answered, but the unmistakable voice of her husband, Eddie. In that single second, the long performance of the happy family ended, and the raw reality of their lives was exposed. There was a terrifying silence on the line, as they both realized that the mask had fallen and could never be put back on again. The silence was the sound of an era ending, and the beginning of a life that was no longer protected by the studio experts. Debbie hung up the phone and the world, as she knew it was gone forever. By the next morning, the news of this confrontation was on every front page, and the three of them were forced to stand in the light of their own mistakes. This moment was the peak of the tragedy, because it showed that even the most beautiful people in the world are fighting a battle between who they are and who they are supposed to be. The shock of the phone call was a signal to the whole nation that the golden age of innocence was over. Elizabeth was no longer just a star, and Debbie was no longer just a wife, and Eddie was no longer just a singer. They were real people with broken hearts and complicated motives. The fallout from this moment was a wave that changed the culture of Hollywood forever. It was the birth of the modern tabloid age, where the private pain of a celebrity became the property of the masses. The phone call was the key that unlocked the secrets they had tried to keep, and it forced them to face a future where they had to be themselves. This was the intersection where the myths were destroyed and the human journey began. After that day, the silence was replaced by a noise that would never stop, and the three of them had to find a way to survive in a world that had finally seen their true faces. The betrayal was the result of three people trying to escape the prison of their own fame and finding that the only way out was to break the rules. Years ago, we saw this as a battle between a saint and a sinner. But today, we see it as a struggle for authenticity in a world that demanded perfection. Time allowed Debbie and Elizabeth to find their way back to each other, which proves that the human spirit can heal even after the most public pain. Many of you will remember the feeling of shock when you heard the news of this triangle, because it taught us that our idols are just as fragile as we are. If you had to choose between living a perfect lie or a messy truth, which one would you pick for your own journey? We look forward to reading your thoughts and your personal memories in the comments below as we celebrate the resilience of these legendary stars.